Welcome to the 32nd Kuznets Memorial Lecture organized by Economic Growth Center. I'm Rohini Pandey, the director of the Economic Growth Center and a professor in the economics department. I'd also like to thank those who are joining us online. I gather we have a record number of people who've chosen to do so. Today's talk is being broadcast and also recorded. We'll invite everyone's participation in the Q&A, but remind you that by being present here today, you consent to have your comments recorded and posted publicly. So the Kuznets Memorial Lecture is an annual talk focusing on issues in economic development, which the Growth Center hosts in honor of Simon Kuznets, the Nobel Prize-winning economist who helped found the center in 1961. Among Kuznets' many achievements was coming up with the original formulation of gross domestic product, or GDP, which he presented in a report to the US Congress in 1937. GDP was soon widely used to measure economic development, but Kuznets himself called his own measure into question. As early as 1934, he cautioned against a narrow focus on GDP, saying the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income. In 1962, he added, distinctions must be kept in mind between quantity and quality of growth, between its costs and returns, and between the short and long term. Today, we're going to hear from Eliana about ideas that illuminate this complicated relationship between the quantity and quality of growth. Eliana's groundbreaking research has shown that customs, beliefs, and other social norms can disrupt the link between wealth and well-being and increase inequality between groups, even as countries get richer. Her work highlights the fact that we can't understand economic development without recognizing the role of informal norm-based institutions, family groups, immigrant communities, traditional gender roles, and others. Eliana is the professor of public policy at Harvard Kennedy School. She will also be the incoming president of the Econometric Society in 2024, a society that Yale has many connections with. In 2020, Eliana received the Birgit Grodal Award, which is awarded annually by the European Economic Association to a woman who has made significant contributions to the economics profession. Personally, I've always been a huge admirer of Eliana's work and how thoughtfully she has worked to improve our profession. I'm delighted that she has agreed to spend this week with us to anchor the Kuznets mini conference tomorrow, which has brought many young leading scholars to our campus, and to deliver the 32nd Kuznets lecture on changing harmful norms. Please join me in welcoming Eliana La Ferrara.
Thank you, Rohini. And so this is an incredible honor for me. So I'm grateful to you, to the EGC, to the department for the hospitality these days. Also, the opportunity to organize this mini conference tomorrow was so welcome, and it allowed me to connect with many of the young researchers that I've interacted with in my first life in Europe. And so you will see, for those of you who are around tomorrow, that there's a lot of commonality and a lot of bridges that I hope we can continue creating between development economists here and in the European continent. So I'd like to start motivating a bit the choice of the topic for this lecture and why I think it's important to talk about norms if we care about development. And as economists, we always emphasize the key role played by incentives, and we tend to think that by giving material incentives through markets or through institutions, we can affect individual behavior. And so changing the structure of incentives is an underlying principle for many of the interventions we have, including anti-poverty interventions. If you look at other social sciences, and here I mentioned psychology, sociology, but in general, the focus there when they analyze behavior is on includes many other factors, for example, identity or social influence. And within these disciplines, norm-based interventions are a lot more common. And in that case, the understanding is that you can change behavior by shifting perception of what is normal, what is expected in one's reference group. So there's no reason why these two approaches should be seen as distinct or mutually exclusive. quite the opposite. In my research, I've tried to understand the extent to which they can complement and reinforce each other. So Rohini mentioned Kuznets, and if you read the motivation for his Nobel Prize, we all associate his contributions to growth, inequality, but the motivation actually mentions his empirically founded interpretation of growth, which has led to a new and deepened insight into the economic and social structure and the process of development. So it is important, I think, also in the context of this lecture to underline that the importance of social factors has been there since the origin of our field and our profession. So I'm going to give you a very quick kind of definition of norms, borrowing from the work of Cristina Bicchieri, who's one of the leading researchers on social norms. And Cristina defines norms as shared behavioral rules that prescribe or proscribe behaviors within a large class of situations. So we can think of norms as a form of grammar. Grammar tells you, how you should arrange words, sentences, what is acceptable, what is not in the way of speaking or writing. And norms, instead of dictating how words are formed and ordered, dictate the behavior that you're expected to engage in particular situations. Now, these behaviors are basically interdependent, and so the individual choice to comply with a norm naturally depends on the expectations of what other people will do. And there's two types of expectations. One empirical or positive, we might think, which is what do you expect other people to do in a similar situation? So how common is it to choose this behavior? Would a sufficiently large fraction of my reference group take this action? The other is the normative expectation. What should you do? Okay, what do others expect that you should do? And in this case, the question becomes, is there a sufficiently large fraction in the community that expects me to behave in a certain way? Okay? And these norms can really play wonderful functions or can become obstacles and be bad norms. So economists have studied the benefits of norms in settings where there are market imperfections, where some markets are absent, institutions are also, have limitations when it comes to enforcement, and there's a lot of work done on, for example, the potential for informal insurance networks and or informal credit and norms that govern cooperative behavior within this type of transactions, which obviously have the potential of facilitating growth. But today we're going to focus on the dark side of norms and of norms that might cause behavior to, in a way that's inefficient, not conducive to growth. So the same type of risk sharing that can function very well to isolate the poor from income fluctuations can also generate excessive pressure or excessive solidarity, as has been documented. Or there can be norms that, prescribe what occupation you are expected to engage in, for example, if you are a member of a certain caste. We'll talk today about a norm which has to do with gender, and unfortunately in the area of gender, there's only an embarrassment in how many of these detrimental works you can find. Well, dowry, we know, are payments associated with marriage that impose very high costs, often in the order of a whole year of income for a family. There's child marriage. I'll talk about female genital cutting. Historically, there were norms like food binding in China, There are norms even to this day, for example, that restrict women's mobility during menstruation. All of these are norms that for us are not so easy to come to terms with, because if we measure the expected costs and benefit in terms of productivity, they don't seem to really play a role that would justify their existence. So having acknowledged this, the question is going to be, why are these norms still there? And if we want to facilitate their disappearance, what can we do as policymakers? And what I want to do today is to take you through two sets of results, considerations, analytical work that I've engaged in. One that looks at the evolution of norms without a specific intervention on behalf of policymakers, and tries to understand to what extent we can expect these norms to fade away on their own. The second is a more hands-on approach, where you think about policy and you say, is there a role for information provision? Can we think that there's some misperception that is keeping these norms alive? What is the role played by culture or by identity? And here I will report on some recent work that I've done with actually some of the people who are here in the audience, and that sheds light using experiments. And in both cases, I will use one of these extremely harmful gender norms, which is female genital cutting. Although I think, at least for the first part, when we talk about evolution and kind of the theoretical analysis of these transitions, I don't think there is anything that is really necessarily specific of FGC in what I will say. Okay? So what is female genital cutting? It is the practice of cutting or removing part of the external or internal female genitalia for non-medical reasons. It's an initiation ritual that's performed on girls between infancy and age 15. Very often it's around 8 to 11 years old that girls are cut. And it's, again, in most cases performed not in a hospital. So there's some risk associated with infection and all traditional health practices. It's actually a widespread norm. There's 200 million girls and women alive today who have been cut in Africa, Middle East, and Asia. And once you have been cut, there can be serious health consequences, both at the time of cutting, as I mentioned, but even later on. Increased risk of STIs, difficulty of giving birth to children. So here you see a map of Africa with a gradient in color that shows you the prevalence of FGC among women in the age range 15 to 49. This is data from UNICEF. And you see there are countries like Somalia where basically the practice is universal. Even countries like Egypt have had extremely high rates, estimated at 91%. The other country I'll talk about today is Sierra Leone. Well, I won't talk about it. I will just quickly reference it, where the practice is at 90%. But you can see how there's a very high prevalence of the practice across Africa. So, the first question that we can try and ask is, if we take a long-term view of how this practice have evolved and what's going to happen in the future, what do we have to say as economists? And I think here it's helpful to understand both modeling choices that have been used and policy approaches in the light of what's been the common wisdom. The common wisdom is that with something negative like FGC, you go in and you say, don't do it, okay? So the models are you have a choice of choosing the detrimental action or the other action. And very often these prescriptions, even when they translate into law, are not respected. So dowry is actually illegal, but it's not disappearing. And similarly, for FGC, many countries have legislation against it. Now, what I'll try to do in this first part is to say, suppose that the goal is to get rid of these norms in the long run. What happens if instead of adopting a 0-1 perspective, you consider a setting where there are intermediate alternatives, so something that is still bad, but a bit less bad than the extreme, okay? And in the example of dowry, you could say instead of outlawing dowry, you could put a cap. In the example of child marriage, you could say instead of saying it's age 18, let's decrease the minimum age at marriage to, say, 16. What would be the effect of something like this? And this is an interesting question because, of course, there can be implications that relate to human rights and values on which I will be silent in this lecture. But taking the kind of efficiency perspective and saying, what is it that's going to make it easier to get rid of the norm in the end, there is a trade-off. So on the positive side, you can think that there are individuals who, if you face them with the choice between a trait and nothing, are still not willing to abandon that trait, so they would stick with the detrimental action. But if you propose a trait that is to some extent a substitute, they might take that step. And then you go one period ahead and you say, now that you are at this different trait, maybe it's easier to take an extra step, and so on and so forth, until you eventually get rid of the norm altogether. And this is what we're going to call stepping stone convergence. But on the negative side, think again about having moved from the extremely bad trait to the intermediate one. What's your incentive to abandon that intermediate trait at that point? Precisely because it's less costly, you might actually decide to stay there forever. Okay? We say that that becomes an absorbing state. In that case, the presence of the intermediate trait has not helped you, quite the opposite. Okay? So we came across this trade-off precisely when we were thinking about policy work in Somalia, because as you will see in Somalia with Selim and other co-authors, as you will see, there are different types of female circumcision. And in our dialogues with policy partners who were holding this very dichotomic view, it's bad and all forms should be really actively discouraged, we started thinking, would it make it easier for us to focus on the most extreme as opposed to the intermediate? But then we also understood, well, there are risks, and we decided to try and use some theory to guide us in our understanding of these trade-offs. So what this paper does is to think about social norms in a setting where is interdependence, but where more than two actions are allowed. We will study the transition dynamics, and we derive conditions under which this type of stepping stone convergence can occur. And then we develop an econometric approach that allows us to test whether these conditions hold in the data. So we collected some data in Somalia and basically tried to map the model to the data to see what can we say about what happened in the past and about the future. And although, as I will show, the Somalia case, we think it's particularly interesting, there's nothing in what I say, especially on the theoretical front, that really makes this study of transition specific to FGC. So why FGC? Then, as an example, if you look at the WHO definition, there are different types of increasing severity. They're called type 1, 2, and 3. And in Somalia, indeed, there are even different names for these practices. Types 1 or 2 and 2 that are less invasive are called SUNA, and type 3 that's more invasive, it's called pharaonic. And so going to the model, I'm going to sometimes use the term SUNA or pharaonic to give you kind of a representation of what these actions are. But just think of this as a model where there's a large population of agents, and they can choose between 3 actions: low, medium, and high. Okay? I'm going to rank them in this way when we think about SUNA, because what I have in mind is the health costs of these actions. Of course, we can go back to this later. If you think about either a religious component or a cultural component, it's not obvious that they would be ordered in this direction. But then again, as you will see, the argument for stepping stone can only exist where there is at least some benefit in moving from the intermediate stage to the other stage. If the intermediate action, SUNA, had both a kind of a health benefit and a cultural benefit and dominated the other two, no stepping stone transition can occur. So at any point, there's a proportion of players that choose a certain action. And what's key, and this is a standard formulation in the analysis of norms, is that your utility from a given action will depend on the vector, which includes, what fraction of the population has chosen the various options. And while you do have an intrinsic utility that's independent from what everyone else is doing, there is this social utility, which is decreasing in the share of people who choose action J different from yours, okay? And how is it decreasing? Well, most models, Brock and Durloff and others, use these social penalty factors where someone who chooses J will inflict a cost S on you when you choose I different from J. So these S parameters are assumed to be positive, okay? They are 0 for those who choose your own action. And so this term is what generates the desire for conformity, okay? And then there's an error term that is assumed to be extreme value distributed. So what do we we assume in the model? As I said, we rank the utility and we assume positive costs. Different from what most of the literature is doing, we're not assuming symmetry. So we allow people who choose I to punish those who choose J in a different way from how those who choose J punish those who choose I, which if you think again of examples, kind of makes sense because it's not obvious that these punishments should be symmetric. This complicates the analysis because you can no longer use potential games and proofs become a little bit more complex. But the key dynamics that we identify are actually, we are able to do it even without the assumption of symmetry. Time is continuous. People receive revision opportunities at random intervals. And so on average, you expect to have one revision opportunity per unit of time. And agents, because of this error term, are going to choose perturbed best responses. So most of the time, they play best response, but there are some deviations. And with the extreme value distributed shocks, it's a well-known result that the probability of choosing a certain action when the state is P is given by this logit function. And when the parameter beta is the precision of the process. So when beta is 0, you're basically choosing at random. When beta tends to 1, you're choosing a best response. And in general, although the dynamics are complex, a lot of the intuition can be gained by looking at the case with a large population and with, that approximate best responses. So I'm going to give you the definition of stepping stone, and then the most important part of the theoretical contribution is understanding the conditions for stepping stone and the transition dynamics. So an action M, which remember is the intermediate one, is a stepping stone if along every dynamic path in the large population limit, when you start from the norm that is the worst action, you have that the fraction of people choosing that decreases over time. The fraction choosing the intermediate action first increases and then decreases. And finally, the fraction that choose the best quote-to-quote action increases until you basically have the majority of the population playing the high action. And the dynamics have this interesting feature that there is an inflection point. So what's the inflection point is when basically you are indifferent between playing the intermediate and the high utility action. That's when finally the process will make the kind of the jump to the best equilibrium. And in this case, we can say that if M is a stepping stone, the transition occurs in the following way. First, people start from the bad norm, and they deviate to the intermediate one. This is what this smaller step is allowing you to do. At some point, there's going to be enough of a fraction of people that are choosing the intermediate that whoever deviates from then on can do the big jump directly. Okay? And that's a function of the fact that by having reduced the fraction of those who are playing the very negative action, the punishments are now decreased because the other group is now fragmented. Some play M, some play S, and so you don't get punished by a big fraction that's playing the L action. Okay? And this is the expression for this inflection point, which we denote with Q star. So if you think about the dynamics, when you have a stepping stone, what happens is that you're starting from an equilibrium where most of the population is playing the L action. I told you in Somalia, 98% of the women are cut. You will see that until more or less the mid-90s, that was actually 98% being cut with pharaonic, the worst form. So we were here, okay? And then you see a transition happening towards the intermediate, which is Sunna, okay? Now, this is kind of a theoretical graph. I'm not telling you that this is what the data suggests. But if in the case where Sunna were a stepping stone, we would be seeing something where the moment you approach Q star, then the system moves to the best equilibrium, which is people actually playing the uncut. But if Sunna becomes absorbing, at that point you go here, and then you get in the basin of attraction of the M norm, and you're no longer reaching the uncut unless you were already starting quite close to that, okay? So when is it that we can expect this virtuous process of convergence to occur? The necessary and sufficient condition in the best response model are three inequalities. So the first inequality here is the ratio of the difference in social sanction when starting, I'm going to give you the Sunna example, starting from pharaonic you deviate to uncut, minus starting from pharaonic you deviate to Sunna. And this is the ratio, the difference in intrinsic utility. So having a relatively large value of this ratio means that the social cost of switching from the, say, worst action to the best one is too high relative to the gain in intrinsic utility that you would get. So that's why you're not doing the big jump directly. What are the other two conditions saying? These conditions are saying that instead, if you compare the social sanctions for going either from pharaonic to Sunna or from Sunna to uncut, and you relate those to the gains in intrinsic utility, this time the sanctions are relatively low, okay? So that's why once you've done the first step, this is why you can do the first step, and this is why once you've done the first step, you can then go to the uncut equilibrium, okay? So you can rearrange these and get that a necessary condition, not sufficient but necessary, is the so-called reverse triangle inequality, which says that the sanction for making the big step directly is at least as large as the sum of the two. And what's very intuitive about this condition? What's intuitive is that it tells you that stepping stone existence is related to a form of convexity in sanctions, okay? So when you get punished more harshly for, deviating a lot from the current state of things, it's a good idea to split it into pieces because the sanctions for each of the steps is relatively lower. Okay? So this is all quite intuitive. So let's take the case of Somalia, and let's try, first of all, to see how these two forms of female circumcision have evolved over time. So with Selim and other co-authors, we collected data in 141 communities across Somalia, sampling over 4,000 individuals, men and women, that took part in community meetings for an experiment that I will then describe. And altogether, this implies having information on cutting for the female respondents and for the daughters, who are approximately 6,500 daughters. And what we know is what type of cutting they had, when they were cut. Then we know attitudes towards cutting, as well as beliefs about community support. And a first thing that to us was quite interesting is that if you look at the incidence of these two types, pharaonic Sunna, across subclans, you see that they're pretty much both present, which means that one type or the other is not an ethnic marker, okay? So it's not about identifying one subclan versus another. You see that the share uncut is, in fact, extremely low in our data as well. The other thing that's interesting, if instead of subclans, you calculate these rates by community, so these are 141 bars, you see that with the few exceptions that are either entirely Sunna or kind of entirely pharaonic, by and large, you see prevalence of both forms in each and every community. And again, unfortunately, not huge shares of uncut women and girls anywhere, okay? So descriptives, the age at which girls are cut here is around 8.5 or 9, depending on the type. And the decision to be cut, when we prompt them and say, who makes this decision, and you can say more than one person, you see, indeed, in most cases, the mother is held responsible for that, okay? In about 1/3 to 40% of the case, also the father. Grandmothers seem to play a lower role. Of course, this does not exclude the fact that the mother might internalize the preferences of the father. So, I'm not making too much out of it, but it's still something that, to some extent, is implemented generation after generation with some element of decision also by women. And I told you, there are utility, intrinsic utility payoffs, which can include many, many factors. Here's only one type of factors that could go in there, and that's the health cost. But these health costs, we find, are quite informative, because when you ask female respondents, did you yourself experience complication, you see that 63% almost experience complication from pharaonic, and only 11% from Sunna. If you go to the next generation, which is the daughters, pharaonic complications are still extremely high, because this is really extremely invasive. Those from Sunna go down to 3%. And then we have the breakdown into what type of complication. And you can see a very similar pattern where from Pharaonic you have all sorts of negative health complications. But with SUNA, it's quite low, okay? And I want you to keep this in mind because you will see what conclusions we reach about the stepping stone. But intuitively, if you are expecting people to have incentives to abandon the practice, for example, because it's very costly in terms of health, this doesn't seem to be in place from their understanding or their experience, okay? So let's try and use the model to shed light on what the transition process looks like. So we need to map into the model, we need approximations for the stock and the flow, okay? And what we're gonna do in the analysis that I show you is to say, remember the cutting age around 9. I'm gonna say that if you are 10 or more, and you have a certain trait, you enter that stock, okay? If you are 10 or more and you're still uncut, but when we prompt your parents, you say, okay, your daughter is uncut, what are you planning to do? And they have an option of say, you know, cut her with this type of circumcision or leave her uncut. If they say that you're gonna be cut, it's just a matter of time, and they give the type of circumcision, we actually attribute that girl to the stock because in our model you get to choose once, okay? So we are trying to map this to the model, and this also helps because at that point, if you are uncut, there's no single point in time where we could pinpoint that you would be uncut, and this way everybody at gets 10 gets assigned to whatever the final action will be, but in the paper we do, we use other forms of computing stocks and flows, and those are similar. So the stock is going to be basically the cumulative proportions for the cohorts we have, and the flow is in any year, you know, how many girls are cut with a certain type of cut, okay? And we use 3-year moving average to get rid of some of the noise, and you know, these results are robust to, instead of 10, using cutoffs of 9, 10, or 12. So here is the evolution of the flow from the early 70s until when we collected the data, okay? So the blue line is giving you the flow of pharaonic cuts. So that means that the women who were cut in these decades were pretty much always cut pharaonic, okay? There's a slow increase in the share SUNA until the early to mid-90s, where you see that suddenly things start speeding up, and then there's SUNA is now the prevalent form of cutting, okay? Everybody, pretty much, most of the people who get cut today are cut with SUNA. There are still some girls cut with pharaonic. You see uncut is quite stable and low. There's this little blip here, but really almost unnoticeable. So if you think about norms transition, we find this to be a pretty striking graph because it really shows one norm being displaced by another. Of course, when you do the stocks, because there's, you know, the early flows contribute to generating a cumulative share of pharaonic that stays high. Of course, you know, the crossing occurs a bit later, but already these days, the stock of SUNA is now higher than that of pharaonic. Okay, so how can we explain that blip? So if you think of the model, what the model is saying is that you're starting from a bad place, PL, that's where we were with a lot of pharaonic, and then you're gonna have some of these error that you know, generate some people choosing SUNA. As that share grows, at some point it reaches a tilting point, okay? So basically the model could endogenously generate that type of transition through the increasing accumulation of SUNA. If you read historical accounts of what happened in Somalia, it's also true that since the mid-80s, human rights organizations were very vocal especially against pharaonic circumcision. And eventually, religious leaders decided to distance themselves from pharaonic and started emphasizes that this was not a requirement of Islam. So you can also think of this as kind of reinforcing the potential dynamics of the model. Why? Because you can think that, the fact that the imams were now endorsing Sunnah relative to pharaonic is going to reduce the sanctions for going from pharaonic to Sunnah. Also, it's going to increase the benefits of Sunnah if you are a religious person, and at the same time, all of these campaigns against pharaonic decrease the relative utility of pharaonic. So all of these kind of can help us look at what happened in the past, make sense of it. But of course, the question we have now is, given that everybody is cutting Sunnah, is this just the first stage of a transition out of FGC completely or not? And here, ideally, you would want to have estimates of those U and S parameters, which are quite difficult to have. And we try to have some survey-based proxies, which we include in the paper to corroborate the other approach, but today I will not show you those results. But what's interesting is that in the absence of those parameters estimates, you can still use some of the properties implied by the model and the estimates of stocks and flows, and that's enough to predict what's going to happen, okay? So I'm going to show you 3 tests that can be used in general, not just for this FGC approach, to understand if a certain action can be a stepping stone. So the first comes from the reverse triangle inequality. Remember, we said that's a necessary condition. And with this logit specification that we have, you can express the log ratio of the flows as a function of utility and then the different stocks. And basically, if you write it for the flow of uncut over Sunnah, you find, sorry, this is a P that's missing. You find that the coefficient on the stock of pharaonic is actually given by a positive constant in the model multiplied by this, okay? What is this expression? It's basically the reverse triangle inequality, because remember that inequality was saying that SLH needs to be at least as large as the sum of these two. So how can you test whether the necessary condition for stepping stone is met? You can run a regression of this log ratio of the flows on the 2 stocks, PH and PL, and just look at whether the coefficient on PL is negative or not, okay? And when you run that regression, you actually find a positive, not a negative coefficient, which is a first way of saying the necessary condition for stepping stone does not hold in the data. So this is test number 1. It's nice. It does rely on the fact that this specific functional form comes from the logit formulation. Second test is what we call equal flow test. This one does not rely on the logit formulation. What is an equal flow? Remember the inflection point. That says that at some point, you're going to have that the utility from the 2 choices is equal if you are on your path to a transition. In particular, you can derive the condition that if at some point you have a decreasing share of, say, pharaonic, and the stock of uncut is at least as large as that of Sunnah, from that point on, the system is predicted to converge to uncut, okay? So this is what would be happening. This is the equal flow, means that at some point, the flow of the 2 is equal, and from that point, you definitely go to uncut. So what have we done? We have computed these sigmas, flow into uncut and flow into Sunnah for every year in our data. And, let me skip this. And we have plotted, the frequency of how many times was this ratio of sigma h to sigma n, 0, 0.5, 0.1, approximated in bins, remember, if you say equal flow and then you're off, it means that the ratio should be 0.5 or larger. And you see that in our data, this ratio is always to the left, okay? So it's a sufficient, not a necessary condition, but we haven't reached that sufficient condition in the data that we have so far. So that's a further confirmation that test 1 and test 2 don't tell us that we are on our path out of SUNA. The last test that we do is to basically simulate the model. So what we're doing is we are estimating the implied dynamics. And again, given our model, we don't need to estimate all the parameters. It's enough to estimate these log odds ratios as a function of the stocks. And because the flows sum up to 1, basically through this we can infer the mapping sigma of P. So when you simulate the model, this is the part for which we actually have the data, okay? This is what's been happening so far. Starting from Pharaonic, the share of Pharaonic goes down, the share of SUNA goes up. You remember that uncut was staying very close to 0. This is what we're getting from the model simulation, okay? And this dotted part is the extrapolation to future years. And it's kind of unequivocally telling us that we're going to end up with SUNA being absorbing, okay? So that's the third piece of evidence. Is this, it's not super uplifting as a conclusion. The truth is that we still have relatively few years in which the flow into uncut has been significant enough. And it's possible that if something changed, so for example, here we're simulating an exogenous shift that increases by 5%, how many people are choosing uncut over SUNA. Actually, with that size of a shift, the simulation predicts that you could get out. So I think there's some room for saying that maybe with more years of data, and if something happened that kind of increased this stock of uncut, aside from the model dynamics per se, we could get out of it, okay? Now, I want to use, so to sum up, if you think of this framework, you could try to facilitate the transition by playing with those parameters that govern the inequality. So you could try to have sanctions being reduced or increase knowledge about the benefits, the relative benefits, or what kind of identity payoffs people attach to this. I want to just emphasize that while I've discussed everything in terms of this FGC example, there are both historical and contemporary examples of norms where this intermediate action can actually be pretty meaningful. One historical example that my co-authors are very fond of is dueling. And in Europe, dueling persisted for quite a long time, and it persisted longer in France than in England. And one of the reasons is apparently that they accepted a less lethal form of weapon, which is like the intermediate action becoming absorbing in a sense. If we think at more kind of recent technological innovation, let's think of smoking and the introduction of electronic cigarettes. This could be a way to help smokers quit, or because the damage is less with e-cigarettes than with regular cigarettes, it might actually lead people not to quit smoking altogether. So I'm told I have 10 minutes, which doesn't leave me too much to talk about policies to change FGC, but I'll try to give you a flavors at least. So if you now think of, let me take wear the hat of a policymaker, be it a government, an NGO, who wants to help this transition out of a harmful norm. What can I do? Well, one thing is that maybe I don't trust people to have all the information they need to assess this intrinsic utility, so I could do information campaigns. Maybe there's something that people attach to these practices that defines how they see themselves, an identity component. And here you could think, does the identity value really depend on the harmful side of the practice or not? And then there are potential explanations that have more to do with the part of the norm that's about the expectation. So for example, maybe people really think that everybody is in favor of cutting, but in private they are not necessarily, and that's a form of pluralistic ignorance. In that case, what you want to do is realign people's beliefs. Or maybe everybody has the exact rational beliefs that they should have, simply nobody wants to move first, okay? So there's a simple coordination failure. And in that case, can you use coordination tools? And some NGOs, for example, Tostan, have used these public declarations when you talk about FGC, working with villages to have a critical mass of families who pledge not to cut their daughters or not to marry their sons to cut daughters. So tomorrow, Lucia will present some work that we've done in Sierra Leone, where FGC is actually part of an initiation ritual that's called Bondo. This is a group ceremony that stretches over 1 month, in the sense that the girls go together in the bush. They are taught how to become mothers, wives. They really create a mutual network of support, and at the conclusion of this month, the cutting ritual is done. And we've worked with the local NGO to test the effectiveness of two potential interventions. One is information about the health costs of FGC, and the other is actually to try and discuss with communities the possibility of using a ritual, or choosing a ritual that includes everything else that's there, but replaces the cutting with an alternative sign, so preserving in some way the symbolic value of the practice. And if you want to know what happens, show up tomorrow. Now, what I want to instead maybe say a little bit more about is another intervention that we did with a subset of the co-authors of the Somalia transitions paper. And this is about beliefs and coordination. So here we're going to tackle this idea that maybe people are privately against FGC, but they misperceive other people's support for it, or there is this coordination failure. So what we've done there is to hold community meetings where, we gather people in a group of about 30 participants in rural villages, and they were given a secret ballot where they could say yes or no if they wanted to abolish pharaonic circumcision. So there was no way to identify who was voting in a certain way. And once they cast their vote, we incentivize everybody to guess what the number of people in support of abandoning pharaonic circumcision would have been, okay? Then in some of the communities, we end the meeting. In these communities, what we will have is the private support for the practice and the beliefs about community-level support. In one group of communities, we open the ballot box and we say, here is how many actually voted in favor of abandoning. So this is the case where you are correcting if there are misperceptions. You are realigning beliefs with the actual preferences. And then we thought, it's important to think that aside from the beliefs part, there might be these coordination problems. So we try to design the lab in the field equivalent of these public declarations. In some communities, the people who was running the meeting drew a circle on the floor and said, if you are in favor of abolishing pharaonic circumcision, you can step into the circle. So this is going to be our coordination treatment. And then there's a third group of communities where we first reveal the share in support, and then we ask who wants to step into the circle. Okay, we have 3 rounds of data collection from 2018 to 21, and there's data on traditional circumcisers that we also have, and I will not discuss now. So first, I'll just show you this graph, which has evidence that there is indeed a significant extent of misperception. Why? Because here you have the share of people who support the abandonment of pharaonic vote, from 0 to 100% of the meeting participants. And the green dashed line is the actual vote, anonymous vote. So we have no reason to think that they lied. This is telling us that, in the vast majority of communities, the share is greater than 60%, with a very large fraction where it's almost close to 100%. But the respondents prior about how many are in favor of abandoning is shifted to the left, which means that they actually expect less support than there is in practice, okay? So this opens the possibility for correcting these misperceived beliefs. And similarly, if you think about coordinator, this is the same thing, which is the guess about those who are in favor of abandoning. So this is the belief. And these are the number of people who ended up entering the circle, okay? So this exercise led more people to step into the circle than what they expected to be the public support for the practice. And I'll skip this one and just go quickly to the result because I'm almost out of time. So first of all, we go there. This is the end line data, so it's 2 years after the intervention. And this is the share of girls who've been pharaonic cut, okay? So, the mean in the control group is quite low because I already told you that nowadays most people cut Sunna. You could say, why did you do the experiment on pharaonic and not on Sunna then? Because in our pilot, we understood that the support for Sunna was quite high. So if you do one of these open the ballot experiments and then you say, 95% of the people are supporting Sunna, you're not going to have much of a decrease in cutting rates. And at the same time, we also did feel that given how much more harmful this practice is, even going from 4% to a lower number was an important goal. And in fact, we managed to reduce it by 1.6 percentage points. Now, what we were not sure would happen and happened, or could have happened or not, and instead happened, was that in this span of 2 years, the rate of Sunna cuts actually went up, and the share of girls who was uncut went down. Okay, so having seen that model with the intermediate action, this is not so surprising because something that can happen is that in fact you go away from pharaonic, you make the step to Sunna, and now that Sunna becomes more appealing, there might be some people who from uncut are induced to actually choose the Sunna. So this would not be a very desirable outcome. However, it's also true that these 2 years after the intervention is not giving you the steady state because girls get cut in a certain age interval. So if we want to know what this does to parents' preferences and to parents' choices for all the girls that they have, including those who are too young to be cut, we should factor in the preferences about uncut girls, okay? So in this table, you have the old result, probability of being uncut goes down, but then we look at whether for those uncut, the parents say that they are planned to be cut in the future or planned not to be cut, okay? And what's happening is that this number masks a reduction in those who are planned to be cut in the future and an increase in those who for the future are planned not to be cut. And indeed, if you look at the age of cutting, it goes down a little bit. And sorry, I didn't say it before, but everything we have in terms of results is pretty much driven by the misperceptions intervention. It turns out that our coordination device didn't work as well. And so, in fact, the age of cutting went down a little bit, which means that that increase in SUNA that we saw is probably, some girls whose cut wasn't anticipated. It was done as SUNA. And then if we take the long-term perspective and say, now let's take everybody, and if you are pharaonic cut now or plan to be, we give you a 1. SUNA cut or plan to be, and uncut and plan to stay uncut. If you take all of this, the end point seems to be that there's actually an increase in the share that in the long term is going to be uncut. Of course, with these plans, we could say maybe it's cheap talk. We don't know what the parents are going to do in the end. So the only thing we can do here is, because we had the midline and the end line, we compared the plans that they gave us at midline with the action that they declare at end line in the age range in which the girls are most at risk. And we have 532 girls, of which basically 39 have been cut when the parents at midline had said she's going to stay uncut. Okay, so we have a 7% deviation from intentions, which again, eventually doesn't seem a hugely important problem, but it's also true that this is all we have in terms of the data. So I'll skip the additional results and just, just say that in the context that we've studied, pluralistic ignorance seems to play a role. And so in that case, simple intervention based on correcting misplaced beliefs is viable. The coordination exercise seemed less effective, and that disregarding this role of intermediate roles is actually a limitation, because we saw that in the short run, at least some of what happens was an increase of the intermediate form. So there's something that I have completely left out of this discussion, and we had a very interesting for me conversation with Rohini Hemsem today, which is actually the role of the law and of the institutions, because all I've tried to discuss is still informally enforced. It's still a way of having the kind of the social norm aspect not sanctioned by an authority, a legal authority. I think it's very important to also pay attention to how legal and institutional solutions to norms change can be implemented when they are successful or not. And also, I think a long-standing question is eventually you want people to own these changes. This means that their attitudes towards harmful norms need to change. So what comes first? Will my attitudes change because I see a different behavior, or is a different behavior generated by attitudinal change? And I haven't found a way of solving this obvious endogeneity problem, but for me, given this type of questions, it's an obvious, important future avenue for more work. So thank you for your patience with me going slightly over time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eliana, for visiting us. So I wanted to just connect the three parts of your presentation. I really liked the experiment you just described in Sierra Leone, which is, beliefs about what other people, my beliefs about...
Somalia.
Oh, sorry, that was Somalia. Okay.
Yeah, Sierra Leone is the tomorrow.
Okay, all right. Okay, I like it even better.
Yeah.
So that's about norms, my beliefs about what other people think I should be doing, right? Now, but in the middle part, when we were talking about this aggregate data and seeing movements from Pharaonic to Sunnah, right? We have these standard problems with those aggregate data that's just about correlated unobservables, right? Like, as you said, it could just be religious edict that matters. So all of that could just be signaling that what we should be focusing on is religious edicts or changing the law or something like that, right? And that's why in the labor literature, how you define, or how Christina Bicchieri, you said, defined norms, it sounded like a strategic complementarity, right? My decision to adopt depends on what other people are doing. And there, in the peer effect literature in labor, we know that we have to be very careful, like the Maas and Moretti type approach on, right? So I just worry, I like the belief part, but I just worry that if you're not careful about how we use the word norms, maybe we would be misattributing the importance of law changes to focusing too much on norms.
Yeah, so thank you. And this helps me clarify something, which I hope I didn't use causal language when I was describing that middle part. If I did, absolutely not intended. But so the way I presented the transition or the flow, it's basically indistinguishable for us, whether it was governed by the dynamics, by the religious leaders' action. We're not, we're not making much out of that. We're just saying this is a context where the three actions make sense. If you take historical data, you see this switch, that's it. What we're trying to use the model for is to say, with aggregate data, what should you see as a precondition for this now getting you out of Sunnah altogether? And we're just showing that we're not seeing that. So it's more like saying, on the basis of what the model predicts, just the evolution of those stocks and flows is not consistent with the second step of the transition. We're not saying that if the religious leaders intervene now, Sunnah would no longer be absorbing. So all of this is, for us, I think, a way of asking, can you use this analytical framework where there is interdependency and where you're just trying to understand, am I in a situation where there is a form of convexity that would generate this pattern of stocks and flows or not? And purely descriptively, you're saying this doesn't match it, but we know that we cannot attribute a cause and effect, especially to the first part of data, because we know there have been also evolutions in the institutional framework that we're not modeling. Let me also say why we decided not to take a path where we start modeling incentives of religious leaders and so on. We were trying to see this as really as applicable as possible to many different types of norms. And the moment we get more serious and more realistic about the Somali institutional setting, we lose the ability to use the same model for e-cigarettes, for example. So this comes at a cost. We know there are some interesting features of what happened there that we're not capturing. But I think it's still instructive to show that even with this extremely stylized framework, we are able to say something about what comes next if the parameters stay constant. So that's another big thing. I don't know if that was the next question by someone, but of course those conditions and everything says that the S's and the U's for the coming years to which we extrapolate are the ones for the past year. Big assumption. Okay. Penny.
First, I think this is super interesting. So I would love to see it applied to smoking. So one type of policy intervention you didn't spend much time on is strong paternalistic interventions. And here I'm thinking of smoking. So in your model, the disutility, the cost of all these practices is extremely high. I don't think any woman or any girl would claim that they enjoyed the practice. As opposed to smoking, where most smokers actually love to smoke. And so the cost there was low, and yet I think somehow we managed, at least in the US, to move from an equilibrium where everyone smoked to one where, at least within the educated class, most people don't smoke. And the only explanation, the only policy intervention I can think of was very strong paternalism. So I'm wondering why you haven't, been more pushy on that front.
Okay. I think we were, if you think of this paternalism, it is not obvious that the appeal of the intermediate norm at that point becomes so crucial. You might as well try and be paternalistic towards the most desirable state. So we had this idea of thinking about stepwise processes. I also don't know, in the smoking case, I do agree there was an important role played by paternalism. I like to think about, things like television and in my view, what happened with smoking was also that it started being considered less cool. So in terms of how young people, for example, choose whether to smoke or not, I think the image around who is a smoker kind of changed over the years. And now it's very interesting, smokers disappeared from movies, and now they're back. And so I do think, and I'm not able to quantify in any way, this is super not grounded in any serious research that I've done, and maybe there is that I can look at. But to me, it was a combination of paternalistic interventions, having certain pictures on the packs of cigarettes and all of that, but also how society started portraying and viewing smokers no longer so desirable. And then I think nowadays strong lobbying to have it back in some form of a desirable practice. But so maybe I didn't think I had so much to say about paternalistic approaches, which doesn't mean that they're not important, similar to the law and the issue of institutions.
So, to follow up on this question, I will maybe frame it a bit differently by talking about not paternalistic approach, but top-down. Like, for instance, you have a powerful imam, that changed his mind. Or you managed to negotiate with the imam and said, why don't you pretend that we are doing this? We pay you this, and then you tell everyone else that we are not going to do this anymore. I think in West Africa, particularly in Benin, for instance, I know a lot of instances where, you are not, they want to stop, let's say, physical punishment for some misbehavior, and the way to do it is you pretend, that this is what you are punishing the person physically, but then you don't. It's as if there is, it becomes just like, a ritual, so that you do it, and then you are not doing it because you minimize, So in this context, for instance, did you have to deal with some kind of local leaders and try to leverage their influence to rethink the whole practice a little bit? Have you run into this?
So it's an excellent point. In the Somali context, we, of course, had to get permission to go in the communities, hold the meetings. There was no point of negotiation or conflict of interest because given that we were not discussing Sunna, but we were only talking about Pharaonic, there is a full alignment, and there are parts of Somalia where imams have even issued fatwas against Pharaonic, in Puntland, for example, in 2018. So in that respect, we were not in a position where we said, let's try together to get out of the practice that you are actually most associated with, which is what the Sunnah is. We did collect the data on circumcisers because we also wanted to understand incentives of the ones who practice it. And you might think that in addition to having the imams sanctioning different ways of performing the ritual or abandoning it, you would also need the compliance by the circumcisers. And so that part to us is interesting to study. I cannot speak for Selim, but if I were to say, what do you think is going to work? Do you feel that everything you've tried is, that's it? I wouldn't say so. I would think that involving the local leaders is probably something that's first order importance. It's not it's something that maybe requires a lot more embeddedness in the local context. Somalia is a very difficult context for us to work in as outsiders, and so. But I do agree with you that it might be, the most promising strategy on paper. In West Africa, it was a bit different because we were very careful with Lucia to try and avoid as much as possible this top-down approach, because in fact the local understanding of Bondo or FGC is a lot less negative than what we portrayed, and the interaction with the communities were handled by this NGO, and this is it's called Amazonian Initiative Movement. It's actually for many years they've been acting off the ground, and what they do is they try and, because it's a secret society thing, they try and say, you choose the sign, you choose what you want to do, but they try and just remove the association of all the good things of Bondo with the cutting. Again, what could there be in terms of institutional partnerships in that case? We think it's slightly more complicated. The government hasn't shown a determination to go against Bondo in Sierra Leone so far. I would love to hear more about Benin, because that's one context where we haven't worked. Thank you.
Okay, I also have a question. So talking a little bit about the law and the institutional setting. So in Somalia, you didn't say if it was illegal to start with.
So I don't think it is illegal, the Sunnah.
But the
Pharaonic has been banned with the...
then the question is a little bit on this top-down or this legal settings. It's who are you punishing, or who is the law against? Is it against the mother? Is it against the doctor who's doing it? And how can you institutionalize and monitor that it happens?
It's not easy at all, because the Sierra Leone is a case where monitoring is super easy because it's a group, and if a bunch of girls are gone for a month. In many other settings, it's done at home. It's a very private act. The only case I'm familiar with, I mentioned it today in our discussion, is that of Burkina Faso. Burkina also has a practice of FGC, but in recent years, the government has it's banned, and the government has decided to enforce the law. So Lucia and I initially thought about doing an intervention in Burkina, and we started some, focus group and pilot work, and it became clear to us that people didn't want to talk about it. They were extremely reluctant to discuss FGC. They said there's no FGC in our communities. And we later learned that there had been trials that had been brought to the rural areas. So instead of, so both the family and the circumcisers were punished, and instead of holding them in the capital, they were on purpose held in locations where the population would become aware. And this apparently, at least in terms of willingness to discuss it or to report it, had an effect. I don't know if it had an effect on cutting rates, but and we haven't gone, back to study why they became serious about enforcing, how they did it. We read about these trials, but I do think that is, it's one instance where finding out about it would probably come from some monitoring of the circumcisers, and then probably that's how they do it.
Thanks for the really interesting presentation. In your model, one thing I was interested in was the fact that the reference group is kind of exogenously given. And I know this is outside the scope of what you talked about, but maybe if you had some speculative thoughts about, what happens when reference groups come into contact with each other, or are there cases where some subgroup might decide to split off and kind of divorce itself from the broader reference group to protect a norm?
Yeah. That's a great question. In fact, almost by definition, if you wanted to split the population into, now my reference group are the people who are choosing my action. I pay no cost, I'm always free to deviate. So I think the problem is interesting to the extent that you cannot fully redefine the reference group in a way to align it to your own preferences. Now, is there a feasible way from an analytical perspective to study, an intermediate version that's not the full population held constant as I did, not the extreme in which my reference group is always whoever thinks about like me, but there's a partition that's different. I'll be honest, I haven't seen anything like this, at least in the social norms literature. Of course, people working on coalitions might have tools that come in handy. And I don't know whether any of what we've done would generalize to that setting. In principle, it should make it easier to transition out because you're always decreasing the punishment if you strategically redefine your reference group. But, there are, if these references groups are there because they also provide, they have a function, you want to have a large enough group that you can do risk sharing with, or so. So there are economies of scale to some extent in keeping these groups not as small as it renders costless this particular action choice. But analytically, I haven't seen anything going in that direction. I agree, it seems a very, very interesting question.
I think we can take one more question.
Thank you very much for the fascinating presentation. I had a question on sort of the risks of norm reversal, particularly within communities where there's sort of an embracing of traditional ideas. Do we see cases where, like over generations, there's a readoption of harmful norms? For example, in cases where grandmothers or mothers are uncut or undergo sort of sunnah, but then their children undergo pharaonic cases?
So we haven't seen that reversal in the data. In fact, the kind of the trend is always for, in our data, mothers maybe having pharaonic and daughters sunnah, and we never see the opposite in the data. I do think that in theory you could actually have that case where there's some backlash, again, maybe coming out of our framework. In our framework, because of that ranking of utilities, by definition, if you manage to overcome the social sanctions and you got to a point where the intrinsic utility is higher, there's no reason to move from there. So you would need some extraneous element to the theory I presented, which empirically, I think, could happen in cases with backlash. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Eliana, for a great talk. And I'd invite everyone to join us now for reception, which I think is in the new economics building. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.